Friday, February 21st. I'm Adam Walsh, and this is The Signal. Today on the show, let's talk Canada. Buy local, Canada first, an uptick in Canadian patriotism. But what does being Canadian even mean? Are you feeling more Canadian pride these days? Is there a danger in having too much pride? We're going to dig into these questions through the next 55 minutes. And we got a little scene setter for you, folks. Here's a little amuse-bouche to the meal of the show. Take a listen.
Canada is the second largest landmass, the first nation in hockey, and the best part of North America. My name is Joe, and I am Canadian.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm not normally a get out and wave the flag kind of person, celebrate Canada Day, all that stuff. But there's just so much aggression in the world, and things seem to be heading in the worst possible direction. So it's time to stand up and be counted if you can stand up in the wind.
All right. You heard there the start of it, that I Am Canadian commercial. Joe, who's in real life, Jeff Douglas, CBC colleague, a CBC radio host. You could Google as it happens there, where he used to work as well, because there's a whole piece on him. The I Am Canadian ad is back in a big way. Its star has mixed feelings. So feel free to spend your afternoon after this show looking at that. Also in that tape there, you're hearing the national anthem, right? Small group gathered over the past weekend on Flag Day, proudly holding the national flag, and that was Krista Van Nostrand, who was at the rally. So today's conversation, right? We've heard from the U.S. president consistently talking about Canada becoming the 51st state. Tariff threat on top of tariff threat. Also threatening to devastate the economy here. So for you folks, we're asking, like I said at the beginning of the show, are you feeling more patriotic, more pride? What does being Canadian even mean? What are you proud of? What do you think about this? Is there such thing as having too much national pride? We'll open the phone lines in the second half of the show. Until then, the text line is open, 709-327-8206. The Signal at cbc.ca. Joining me here in studio, we've got Professor Scott Matthews, right? Poli-Sci Prof, head of the Department of Poli-Sci. Amanda Bittner, professor of Poli-Sci at Memorial University. John Duke is here, vice president of M5 and the head of brand strategy. And Desmond Smith, who is a registered marriage and family therapist, as well, a Newfoundlander who spent over 2 decades living in the United States and recently returned home. Thanks for joining us, folks. How are we all doing?
Not too bad.
You're like, Adam, that's a weird question to ask after everything you just said. Okay, then let's start there. With this moment, how do you feel we're doing as a country or province? What's stacked up against us, and how are we doing with this whole Canada thing? Scott Matthews, we'll start with you.
Well, headwinds, I think we're facing kind of in every dimension, not just outdoors today, but I think challenging times, especially because of all the uncertainty that Trump is creating for us. Most of what's happened so far is that he's done maybe some symbolic kind of damage to our relationship, but so far the tariffs, the actual material kind of consequences of his behavior or his ideas we're not feeling, except for the uncertainty and how that affects business and all of us personally. So I think that's where I'm at too, uncertainty.
Uncertainty. All right. So the kicking off point, the word of the day so far is uncertainty. Amanda Bittner, Professor Bittner, what are your thoughts? Is that your word of the day?
No, my word of the day is destabilization.
Okay.
Only because I think so many of us Canadians have, for a long time, we're very aware of what the U.S. does. We're getting the news, we're seeing the stuff, we're reading the books, we're watching the movies. We get a lot of the same media. And I think for the most part, while we don't think of ourselves as being like Americans, we have a lot of things in common. And so now here we are, we've got this new world order, which makes no sense. And every day new news is coming out that just even makes less sense. And right when you think it can't get wackier, it does. And so I think most of us are trying to just make sense of it and trying to apply well, what could the logic be? What is the end game? Is this a big chess game and there's a strategy? Like, what's actually happening? And so every single announcement that gets made just serves to destabilize us each individually and also nationally and also globally further. We're all just like I'm really bad at metaphors, but like on a ship that's rocking back and forth and we're trying to get our footing and we can't really because the ship just keeps moving in weird directions. And I think that's hard for a lot of us. And so we're seeing people trying to respond through this kind of uptick in flags, let's say.
Yeah, is it chess? Is it three-dimensional chess?
It's totally
is it
wacky.
someone just putting checkers pieces up their nose? Like, what is the game we're playing? Great.
The last one.
It's definitely the nose thing. Yeah.
Don't know how that went into my head. Don't know what it says about me. Luckily, we've got a therapist on hand. Hey, Desmond Smith, how you doing?
Tell me more about the checkers. Yeah, it's good. Thanks for having me in. If we're going with the word of the day thing, I would probably say I may use a hyphenated phrase
Nice.
or something
Do you
like
have a
that.
semicolon in the middle of your phrase?
It's "Are you kidding me?" So my story is one where I've been living in the U.S. I'd lived in the U.S. since 2002, and just moved back in October. So I had all of this amazing sort of national pride crossing the border into St. Stephen in the truck, and dancing the jig with my wife when we get to Port Basque. And then Trump gets elected again, and we start hearing the 51st state kind of conversation. I'm like, are you kidding me? I just turned in my green card. I thought I was clear of this. And so there is a bit of a frustration, I guess, with the experience that I had there over several years of experiencing Trump in his first term, and then just this the disbelief that this can actually follow me here too.
Yeah, right. You're like, I thought we were leaving that,
Right.
but here we are.
Yeah.
Okay, there's lots to unpack there, but I'm going to go to John Duke first, then go back. Word of the day.
For me, I think it's about the story arc. If I kind of think about Canada over the last 10 years, both how we're viewed in the world, but then more importantly, probably how we view ourselves, right? So if we go back to pre-pandemic and even the pandemic period and how we came together during that, and some of the conversations, around reconciliation and how we looked at the country and how we celebrated Canada Day, and then on to the use of our symbols, our national symbols during things like the trucker convoy and how things took on a different connotation. And now we're here today, where last Sunday we're neighbors and people had Canadian flags again flying out their cars and kind of taking ownership of that again. So for me, it's about the narrative we kind of tell ourselves about Canada, how that's evolved, and kind of how we see our place in the world going forward.
What is Canada's place in the world? I've got mixed thoughts on that. For living away, because sometimes I feel in Canada, when I was growing up here, then in the reserves and talking to folks, and same as sometimes with Newfoundland and Labrador, people can feel perhaps an oversensed impact of who we are and what we are. And then I was living in Japan, and I can't tell you that my Japanese colleagues did not care what Canada thought. But I know that the perception of Canada, nice place, maple syrup, good place to visit, maybe live, is also there. So what do you think of who we are and what we are as Canada?
Well, I mean, I think to outsiders might be different from what we really are and what we think of ourselves. I mean, I would say Canada is a very prosperous country with very sort of strong relationships with most of the leading countries in the world, and with very good prospects. Lots of problems that we need to solve, from reconciliation with Indigenous peoples to climate change, which we're a part of. We can't solve it on our own, but we can, and historically have played leading roles in attacking these kinds of issues. But we have a lot of assets, a lot of resources to draw on as a country. So I think that's who we are. But yeah, I don't think we enter the awareness of a lot of people. Most frustratingly, a lot of Americans, especially the further they get away from the 49th parallel. But it's shocking how even if you're right on the 49th parallel in the U.S., sometimes it feels like they don't have much more knowledge of Canada. But in any case, I think the global perception generally positive. Maple syrup and kindness, politeness, Celine Dion and a few other people, but
Maple syrup, kindness, Celine Dion, and a few other people.
Yeah.
The Canada story.
That's the Canada story. Yeah.
I mean, I'll say, I lived in Charlotte, North Carolina for the majority of the time that I was in the U.S., so well away from the 49th parallel. And we'll just kind of echo the sentiment that, there was nothing, in sort of the public discourse about Canada whatsoever, right? So, even if you were watching, national news, CNN or something like that, Canada wouldn't enter into the conversation. And similarly, like, people obviously knew of Canada. They knew it was generally north. And then beyond that, they didn't have a whole lot to say about it other than, oh, yeah, they seem nice.
Yeah. That's colleagues of mine in the past when I was living abroad, same thing, right? Like, one was from Chicago, and she had no idea where Newfoundland and Labrador was. And I was like, no, the big island on the right hand off the, and she's like, no, come on. And I was like, okay, fine. So then talk about coming back and what the attraction was to come back to Canada, because that's a branding thing too, right? I mean, it's home, but it's also like your thought of the country. I
mean, the short answer, and probably the answer that I give most people, and the answer that's true, is that all of our family is here. My wife and I are both from here. We have nieces and nephews and siblings and parents that are all getting older. And after having been there for a couple of decades, we knew it was time to get home to spend time with family. But I will say that the true part of my story, another true part of my story, is that for me, what had been a really just sort of ethereal conversation that we would revisit from time to time, will we ever move back to Newfoundland, for me became really solidified on January 6th at the during the Capitol riots. That day for me was the day that I mark as like, oh no, it's time for us to go, and it's time for us to get out of here prior to the next election.
Right. Yeah, January 6th. And then you're like, okay, let's make some plans.
Yeah.
And I know you mentioned, like, it feels like the U.S. is following you back here. We have the 51st state stuff,
Sure.
but getting settled here, because reentry can be kind of weird to come back home because home is not what it was, right? So what's the reentry been like, other than like the American shadowing? What's it been like?
You know what? It's been, I've not had a single regret, not once. I mean, for me, the even more backstory, when I think about sort of Trump's first term, and I think about issues like when he was inaugurated and very quickly sort of moved to implement travel bans from Muslim majority countries and those kind of things. Like, that is probably one of the first times that I look back on as a real kind of defining myself against against America, for lack of a better term, right? There was a real sort of anti-American awareness in my own identity, my own definition at that point. And so I think for me, the work of moving back started at least in 2016. Yeah. And had been a mental exercise and reflective exercise, for the last nearly 10 years. So re-entering Canada, when I say I danced a jig in Port aux Basques, and I cried tears of joy in St. Stephen, like, all those things are literally and figuratively true.
John Duke, when we think about branding here and like this, the calls for buy local, buy Canadian, does that stuff ever make a difference?
It's hard. I think, you probably need to talk to an economist at kind of the macroeconomic level. The economies are so intertwined that, what is actually local at the end of the day in terms of inputs or machinery or things like that. The gold standard would be, locally owned, local staff, local inputs, even machinery, all that type of stuff. And they treat their employees well and are ethical. But I think, macroeconomically, it's challenging to make a difference. But what I would say is, similar to COVID, you can still save what you loved with your dollars, right? So you can vote with your dollars to protect the things that you care about. And you can also be conscious about the choices you make. It's interesting, some recent research has showed those most likely to kind of double down on that, really take the time to it, tend to be a little bit more affluent, tend to have a little bit more time to do those things, so they can have an outsized impact in terms of whether it's our restaurants, groceries, all those things, helping out producers and artisans in this time. So it can make an impact in your local community, kind of the large-scale picture, how much we can displace in terms of the demand that's gone. That's definitely another question.
For Canada-U.S. relations, I'm looking at the political science profs here. When's it been this? I don't even know what word to use. Weird /bad / like is this uncharted territory right now? for relations? And I mean, like, for 20th century beyond, because before that, like.
Yeah, I think in most of our living memory, it's not been like this. We might as individuals, for example, compare ourselves to Americans and think, okay, well, we're not like them. We don't have guns, for example, or we don't really care about that stuff. We're different. But in actual fact, we're quite similar. And I think we've had almost like a sibling relationship for a long time. Yeah. And I think that we as Canadians, I think both individuals and governments have at least the last, let's say, 50 years, taken for granted the chill borders, the economic relationship, the expectation that we can buy American goods and they can buy our goods and there's no big issue. We have for years not really invested heavily in defense, for example, because we've relied upon them to do that work for us. And we have a particular idea of ourselves as peacekeepers in the world, which may or may not be true. But I think that has come about because of our expectations of how things work. And suddenly this destabilization I'm talking about, it's not working that way right now. So now what do? Are we suddenly going to have like really serious borders? Are we going to invest in more guns? Like, what are we actually going to do to defend ourselves? It's very weird.
Oh, I saw a post yesterday, and regardless of the merit of it, but just as an indication of some thoughts of some people out there, someone put a post up saying we need to look at nuclearizing, and I've never seen that before. And I don't mean like nuclearizing for turning on the lights in homes across the country either, right? Like because all of a sudden, if that nuclear umbrella changes, and if NATO changes, and if there's a different type of a defense posture, what are we doing?
It's a scary one, right? And I think part of the challenge is, and probably Desmond, you can speak more to this, but most of us don't make good decisions when we're scared. So like fear-based action is bad news, right? And so if we're suddenly all scared, we suddenly all make really dumb decisions collectively, individually, and so on that can create these dangerous situations that we would never have imagined even 5 years ago that we would need to worry about. And so that is scary for the future. And so I'm not surprised that folks are talking about going nuclear because
like literally
exactly. But like that outcome, and it's one that I think a lot of us think about more and more, that's a bad outcome. We don't actually want that. And so the consequences of trying to defend ourselves in that kind of a way are really dire.
Well, if we're looking at branding, right, if all of a sudden internationally Canada were to like entertain a conversation on that, like that's not on brand for Canada, right? Like I'm looking at the brand expert here.
Yeah. So going back to the earlier conversation, and when we talk about marketing brand, we usually talk about aided and unaided awareness. So unaided would be very low, as everybody's talked about. They don't think about us a whole lot. But when we ask, or more specifically when Ipsos, a research company, asks, we're still rated on the National Brand Index as number 3 in the world, with Japan and Germany. And it's all those things we just talked about in terms of quality of life, safety, trustworthiness, all those qualities, and that's what we're seeing in the world. We're far from that middle power that punches above our weight. We used to be that type of thing in terms of our place in the world, but that's still what comes to mind in terms of word associations for folks.
Yeah, we had aircraft carriers after World War II, right? Don't have them anymore. Is this damage permanent? Because, for example, here's another one that's been floating around, a Leger poll. Do you consider the United States to be an ally, a neutral country, or an enemy country? So it's an online poll, 1,550 people, February 17th. It said an ally, 30%, a neutral country, 27%, an enemy country, 27%.
Wow.
And again, looking at reactions, right, because it's been floating around on Twitter/X, other social media spots. You get folks in the States commenting on it as well, who are like the ones who attuned to what's happening here. And that's a massive shift, regardless. And the fact that there are folks looking at it being like, oh, I could see that.
Well, I mean, any one question about any matter of public policy is liable to vary quite a lot over time and to be affected greatly by whatever happens to be in the news. And when you're talking about matters of foreign policy and international security, it's even more the case. I mean, this is the classic kind of domain in which political attitudes are really not really attitudes at all. They're not stable. They're not meaningful.
You can change tomorrow.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
They can change tomorrow. And so I expect that this is an opportunity for Canadians who are mad about Trump, mad about the tariffs, to express some of that by saying, they're not an ally, or not saying they're an ally, saying they don't know, or somewhere in between. There's no reason, I think, to think that part of public opinion will be durable, absent this posture in the United States towards Canada itself, kind of outlasting Trump, and really having some real bite on the relationship materially. Because again, so far the tariffs are threats. Yeah. And our relationship is still intact. I'm positive that Canada and the U.S. are still cooperating on security, on international crime, on a host of other dimensions. A lot of what Trump is doing that's directed domestically at Americans is also mostly just talk at this point. I'm not saying it's going to stay that way, but I think our relationship with the U.S. is uncertain, but I'm certainly, in that distribution of future possibilities, I think it's unlikely to persist in this way. That would be my guess.
I mean, one thing I want to build on that, though, this question about is the damage permanent? I think Scott's right. In terms of public opinion, that can shift on this topic quite easily, depending on what happens. But I think part of what might be permanent is how we respond. So, for example, if Canada decides to go nuclear or to suddenly beef up its expenditures on defense or whatever, then where are we taking money away from instead, right? So that would turn us away from potentially thinking about, I don't know, fixing drinking water on reserve, as an example, across the country. So, are we turning outward and focusing our attentions and our resources and our investments on defending ourselves against this unknown monster? Or are we turning inward and thinking about the community that is us already, that needs taking care of and that isn't going to be taken care of? It's already poorly being taken care of as it is. So how do we manage that? And so if we allocate resources in one area, we're saying no in another area. And so what is that trade-off that we're taking, and what are the long-term effects of that?
Anyone else on that?
I mean, for me, I just think through, like, from a mental health perspective, right, that if we take this down to a relational level, right, like a couple or just anybody in a relationship, when somebody is behaving in an untrustworthy, abusive kind of way, right? There are certain behaviors that I might recommend to the person on the receiving end of those things. We'd be talking about things like let's review some boundaries here. Like let's talk about communication. Let's talk about some things. And so I think I think yes, it's definitely possible to come back from this, and it is a two-sided process.
Right. Here's a couple of things that have been said in the last couple of weeks, right? You've got former Prime Minister Stephen Harper saying, I will be prepared, and this is from a National Post article quoting him from a private event he was at, quote, I would be prepared to impoverish the country and not be annexed if that was the option we're facing, so unquote, former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. There's a piece in the Globe and Mail, I think it was yesterday, Lloyd Axworthy, former foreign minister, current chair of the World Refugee and Migration Council. He says, Canadians now face a stark reality, living beside a powerful neighbor presided over by an uber president who seeks to erode our sovereignty and absorb us into his imperfect union. What was once dismissed as a joke or a negotiating tactic is beginning to look disturbingly real. Donald Trump wants Canada not for our social safety net, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or our history of cultural tolerance, but for our resources, our minerals, water, oil, and Arctic region. How far will he go? We already know he's wielding tariffs as weapons. And then it goes on, but he says, we've seen his daily insults directed at our leaders, his mockery of our national identity, all well-worn techniques of ambitious autocrats. We should also brace for a more insidious threat, election interference. So we're talking about jokes of the 50s. Everyone's always joking about the 51st state, and what does this mean? And that's like from a former conservative prime minister and a former liberal foreign minister. These are not comfortable things to listen to when we think of beyond 2025. What do you folks think?
Well, I mean, I think Trump is serious,
yeah.
But it's not quite the same as treating the things that he's talking about as serious possibilities. He's already disrupting the relationship. He's probably prepared to disrupt the economic relationship. But that's very different from the United States annexing Canada.
Yeah.
I mean, as we were discussing off air, and as I've pointed out to a lot of people, of course, Trump doesn't really want Canada to be a 51st state. That would be really bad news for the Republican Party in the short term and the long term. He's just not thought about that. I mean, he doesn't seem to think much beyond very immediate associations that he has with, countries, with topics. And so Canada's not going to become a 51st state because Trump wouldn't want that outcome, but they also don't need that outcome. I mean, the great irony of all of this is you already have Canada exactly where you want it. You have access to all of these things. We lack the capability to defend ourselves. That is actually good for the United States. I mean, it doesn't increase America's security for Canada to be talking about nuclearizing, for Europe to decide it needs to be able to defend itself. I mean, there is no world in which that's good for the U.S. and its security. So all to say that, I mean, I think we take Trump seriously, and he's absolutely going to be quite disruptive. But we don't, I think, necessarily have to plan for the specific form of this kind of disruption that he talks about, because it's just not good for America. And I think over time, that will be more and more apparent. I mean, the tariffs haven't happened yet. They might not happen in a week and a half anyway.
Right.
I think that, when I think about Trump, I think about yes, taking him seriously, but then understanding it through the context of what they're already telling us, right? With people like Steve Bannon talking about, flooding the zone. The metaphor that I think about when I think about Trump in everything that he says is just he's launching all of these sort of trial balloons and seeing where the next, the next best possible route to move forward is, right? And he's doing this dozens of times a day, obviously. And so, yes, take him seriously, but also understand within the context of how he is operating so far outside of, whatever sort of political norms have existed in the U.S. previously.
I mean, I think on that level, the interesting question for us, which is not really about Canada per se, but it's more about what's going on with Americans? What is happening in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party that, and thinking even about the Republicans specifically, this is a party that is known for caring about small government, yes, but economic success, right? If you suddenly apply tariffs, which means your people have to pay more for stuff, that's not really good for the economy. It's not good for your voters. So why are elite Republicans just laying down and saying no problem? This kind of stuff is what I wonder about all the time. Is what is their end game? What is their strategy? And where do they think this is going to go? And why haven't democratic institutions, I mean, we know that they're just written down on paper and anybody can ignore them. But why haven't these people who supposedly believe in democracy, in this supposed country that is one of the great bastions of democracy, or so they say, why is that happening right now? And what can we learn from that? Because I think actually we can learn from that our democratic institutions here in Canada are also fragile. And unless we're on it, unless we have opposition parties that take their job seriously, and even governing party members that take their job seriously of upholding democracy, we could be just like them.
I mean, I think part of it is that there's a good chunk of the Republican Party, elected Republican Party, that agrees with Trump, so nothing to resist. And those who disagree are hoping it won't actually kind of be realized. And so there's a lot of, when Ukraine this week has been kind of more of the focus in the U.S. and some of the things that Trump has said. People do not want, senators do not want to be cornered on this. They're, I've seen a lot of footage of them running into elevators.
Scurrying into
elevators.
Yeah.
And then the few who have said things have, used this kind of doublespeak that they have been, learned to use over the last 8 years, where they say, oh, well, we have to give him space. We have to give him room. We know he's a great negotiator. And then there are others who are actually saying, affirmatively, Zelensky is the elected president. He's not a dictator. We have to stand with them.
50% popularity as opposed to the single digit or something number that was put out by President Trump.
Yeah.
I think about earlier, as Amanda mentioned, we rely on the U.S. so much economically protection in just so many ways, right? So what does happen is the U.S. Canadians become destabilized. I think I saw something that only next to India it will be the other major country hit the hardest by climate change. So as those forces impact all the political stuff that's happening, as we're not able to rely on those for economic or political or military protection, how do we diversify? And as Amanda said earlier, what do we need to invest in, and what does that take away in terms of nation building and the things we believe in as Canada?
I'm Adam Walsh. You're listening to The Signal. Today we're asking, there's been an uptick in Canadian pride, patriotism, whatever you want to call it. We're asking, what are your thoughts on that? Are you feeling more Canadian pride? What do you think about Canada-U.S. relations? If you want to join the conversation, 709-722-7111, 1-800-563-8255. You can text us, 709-327-8206, thesignal@cbc.ca for emails. What's the difference between the concept for American versus Canadian freedom, right? The true north, strong and free, versus like freedom, freedom fries, and all that stuff. Like, is there a difference?
That's a big question.
What do we think? And does it matter?
Oh, wow. We're like the nerds here are looking at each other like, how are we going to tackle this in only half an hour?
My next book is getting ready. Here we go.
I think that we all have different ideas of freedom. And so for individuals, it might be access to clean drinking water, a thing that I already brought up, or it might be that you can choose what to do with your body, or it might be that you can choose who you're going to marry or whatever. If we're thinking about kind of snapshots or caricatures, which we can certainly do. And there's lots of stories about what it means to be Canadian, which is about what, like moose and hockey and maple syrup or whatever. All of these things don't apply to most of us, but okay. And I think that if we're caricaturizing the U.S., we think about things like guns and goods and money. And like, that's not pretty either. So nationalism at its core, this idea of what it means to be us, and we can be us, and we have sovereignty over our space and whatever, and our people. If taken to the maple syrup hockey version is delightful and lovely, and yeah, rah rah, and my neighbor has a flag in their window, great. The nasty version is really ugly, and we've seen that lots of times in history too, where freedom is freedom for me and not freedom for you because you're the other, and that's where things get dangerous and have happened in our countries, both countries, and could easily happen again. And this goes back to that question of turning outward versus turning inward. Who are we including as being part of us, and who do we take care of, and how does that get decided?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I often think about, I'm a political scientist who studies political attitudes and public opinion in Canada and the U.S. So I tend to think of it in very specific ways. And so I think of it in terms of political values, kind of commitments to freedom in the abstract, equality in the abstract, traditional values as well. The kind of dirty little secret is that when we compare Canadians and Americans, on average, the differences aren't that large. And Canada as a whole, on a lot of these indicators, would appear, less progressive than, say,
Absolutely.
California.
Yeah.
And certainly less progressive than urban parts of California. And so it's easy to overstate the differences. There are differences, but we don't want to overstate them. This is not just at the level of attitudes, but our political institutions reflect a common inheritance from the United Kingdom, but also, the Bill of Rights is the first draft, if you like, for the Charter of Rights, almost 2 centuries later. Our legal jurisprudence is totally imbued with American concepts as well. So there are some differences at the margins, and we certainly elect different governments than Americans tend to. But I don't think that's really about values. That's about how our electoral system works, how power is divided up in these different places, the geography. But at the level of values, I don't really think we're all that different.
But are they not changing with Trumpism, or are they staying the same? Has there been a shift in values?
I think that that is kind of yet to be seen. For me, values are kind of long-term, fairly stable kind of orientations that move but slowly.
Climate change, not weather. right?
Right, exactly.
Nice.
And
Good one.
Hey, every so
A
often.
plus.
Yes.
Well, and the thing in the U.S. is that, polarization, it is common to think about political polarization in the U.S. as something about the right. The right has gotten extreme. The right has moved away from the center and from traditional American values. And that's all true, but the left has also been moving away in response. I think most people would concede that a lot of it is a response, more recently anyway, to what's been happening on the right. But the left has also is also further left than it used to be, and the parties are absolutely more polar than they have been in the past. On average, we may end up kind of in somewhere where we've always been in the U.S. With these kind of offsetting dynamics in public opinion.
We've got a couple of callers on the line, so we'll take a couple of calls and we'll go back to the chat. Gavin Will is calling from Portugal Cove, St. Phillips. Hi, Gavin. How you doing?
I'm doing great, Adam.
Thoughts? That's my big question for you.
Thoughts. Okay, I was thinking about the original question, which is, is this swell in national pride a good thing, and are there boundaries? I think it is a good thing, but I think that there are boundaries that need to be drawn. There's a big difference between patriotism, which is love for one's country, and nationalism, where we pit ourselves against others. And I think we've seen a little bit of that. I mean, I understand why people have been, booing the American national anthem and stuff like that, but that doesn't really do a lot to bring people together. And you're kind of when people do that, they say that you're American, therefore you're on the side of the bad, and of course things are a lot more nuanced than that. And but by identifying yourself as being not American I understand it, but you risk driving away people in the United States who are in the majority, actually, who do not approve of what they've been seeing in their own country.
Yeah, so patriotism, one thing, but also think about actions and words, because it's nice to have folks on board, especially in the current climate.
Yes, absolutely.
Excellent. Gavin, thanks for the call.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you.
All right, we'll go to the other caller, then we'll go back to the guests in studio. Richard Whitaker is on the line from Portugal Cove. Another Portugal Cove St. Phillips caller. Fantastic. Hi, Mr. Whitaker. How you doing?
We're at the heart of political activism,
and
or something.
The heart of the Signals ratings from the look of it here today. So thanks for the call. Thoughts?
Anyway, a couple of thoughts. One of the things that strikes me is that Canadians don't really take themselves seriously a lot of the time, whereas Americans do, and that's a problem. And, it sets the tone, if you like to think of it that way. When you stick a pin into Canadians, they can take themselves seriously, as we've seen. The other thing that I think we need to, we're going to have to simply wait it out. It's quite clear that the Trump White House, everyone in it is a few bricks short of a load from the sound of it. And we need to wait for it to implode. It will do so, I think, eventually. Because sooner or later, the average American's going to realize this is not tolerable, And I think that's where we have to do that and so on. Meanwhile, it's important for Canada and the rest of the world to keep supporting things like the Ukraine, not bow down to the U.S. attitude and so on. We'll see what happens.
All right. I appreciate your comments and calls, as always, Mr. Whitaker. Thank you so much. And be
You're
careful
welcome.
with the snow now. All right, Dick Whitaker calling there from Portugal Cove as well. This is The Signal. I'm Adam Walsh. Guests here in studio, two poli-sci profs, Amanda Bittner and Scott Matthews. We've got Desmond Smith here, Newfoundlander, who lived in the States for over 20 years with his wife, recently returned home, also a registered marriage and family therapist, and John Duke, Vice President of M5 and the head of brand strategy. Thoughts on either what Gavin or Mr. Whitaker had to say there, folks?
I think the first call in kind of responding to the idea of defining yourself as non-American, when I use that term, that phrase, what I'm really describing, I guess I'm using it as shorthand for anti some of the more extreme views, some of the political maneuvering and things that are happening there now. Some of my best friends in the world are in Charlotte, North Carolina, and obviously having spent so long there, I'm not defining myself against them. And I think it's important to be able to differentiate, in a conversation like this with us. And I think, Amanda, you've mentioned already the idea of caricaturizing, folks and people and countries, being able to kind of to move in and out of those kind of domains.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I really liked Gavin's and Dick's comments, and I think the U.S. is a lot more, thank God, than the Trump administration and any administration. Just like Canada is a lot more than what happens in Ottawa or in the Confederation building. I think particularly for those of us, it's not so much the case in Newfoundland and Labrador, but a lot of Canadians live very close to the U.S. and have spent a lot of time in the U.S. Since they were kids. That applies to me, or lived in the U.S. for periods, which applies to me as well. And so America is so much more to me than politics, and American politics is so much more to me than what's happening in this moment. I'm a student of American politics, and I embrace a lot of parts of the American political tradition. There's a lot to be proud of there. And so, like Gavin, I don't love the booing of the Star-Spangled Banner. I'm not saying it's the best song or anything, but symbolically, it's important to Americans. It's not Donald Trump's song. And so I realize it probably feels good to boo that for a lot of people. But for me, it makes me feel really uncomfortable because it's just not. I don't think it's how Canadians really feel on average about America. It's just in this moment, our identity is threatened. This is a standard kind of way that people react under threat like this. We get defensive. We start to derogate the outgroup, as the social psychologists would say, and kind of homogenize the outgroup. These are all bad things.
So I've seen a lot of posts of folks about the booing, right? They're like, oh, Americans need to understand that we're not booing you. It's actually we're booing Donald Trump. But as we already talked about during this show, when you have folks who don't think about us at all, is that question a bit perhaps too big of an ask? You're like, what are you talking about? I'm hearing you boo my anthem. I like it.
That's right.
It upsets me.
Yeah, it's a lot to tease through. Like that's too complex.
Yeah.
Right. Now, fortunately, they don't seem to have heard us quite so much, judging by the kind of faint booing of our national anthem last night in Boston at the hockey game. That may be because it's Boston, where Massachusetts not the most friendly state for Donald Trump. But another possibility, and probably a very real one, is that they're not paying as much attention to all of this as we are anyway.
Yeah.
So that's
maybe they're
comforting.
more polite than Canadians.
Maybe they are.
And I will not think of a caricature of people in Boston at all
No,
as you say that.
Nor will I.
I have zero references in my head. Zero. Nope. There's none.
Me too.
Well, and I wonder too, like for me, as I've been thinking through the booing again from an individual perspective, thinking from a counseling sort of perspective. Yes, there's definitely elements of this where we feel helpless, where we're getting defensive, we're feeling attacked in some way. We are looking for something to do in response to that. So I think, on an individual level, certainly that's understandable. Whether or not it's, the best rational choice to make, stands to be seen. But certainly, understandable from an individual perspective. And then I think on the other end, with most of the Americans in that building are not paying attention to us. But we know on some level that Donald Trump is aware that there's some booing of the anthem that's happening. And, at least the perception of, the reality right now is that everything is flowing through, Trump's mandate and sort of through his mind. And so maybe there is some value in speaking directly to him and, what is arguably, at least from this, the Four Nations Face-Off Go Canada, one of the largest platforms that, we've been a part of in recent, or certainly since all this started.
Mm.
As you were living in the States, did you start to feel American at any point? Like, it's because to be gone for a couple decades. It for me, it's a striking thing for me. I've lived away for my 20s. I was away, and then another 3.5-year stint. And I like that first time especially. I started to feel a little different about who I was as relation to Newfoundland and Labrador and Canada. And then I came back and whatever. But what about yourself?
No, not really. I would say that, early on, I think some of those questions, some questions that I would get a lot, right? Initially, I was there on a work visa, temporary work visa. And so the questions that would sort of naturally flow from friends and coworkers and those sorts of things, like, what are you going to do when this runs out? Like, are you going to apply for citizenship or those kind of things? Like, and so there was some kind of thoughtfulness at that point. Is this where I want to end up permanently? But and even through some of the those early years that I was there, whether it was even through like when Bush was president or when Obama was president, there was some really positive sort of vibes that I had towards the U.S. But to see the backlash politically, when Trump first got elected the first time around, and the sort of the sort of conversations that were being had and some of the values that were being expressed through that, I think that for me, was really sort of the defining point, right? There's a lot of what I have to offer will be anecdotes, but I mean, I think, when that initial travel ban sort of thing happened, like one of the things that I wanted to do in defining myself as against this, I had some T-shirts printed that said non-citizen, some stars, some stripes, non-citizen.
How'd that work out for you?
One guy asked me about it at a coffee shop, but otherwise it was, it seemed like nobody seemed to care.
Very nuanced.
Yeah, it's very nuanced, right? But it was important for me. I think in the same way that maybe for some people booing at a national anthem right now might be important as in my own sort of individual act of defiance or act of definition, maybe, identity.
I was sent to the first inauguration for Donald Trump because it was when I was in Japan with the Japanese broadcaster. And the thing that I noticed, and I've been to the States before, but I'd never been to something like this. And I had, you watch these things growing up on TV or whatever. But then when I was there that day on the National Mall or whatever, on the white thing that they had laid out with the crowd. We can talk about the crowd size later. The one thing I did notice was there were some skinheads walking around, members of the alt-right with like symbols, and I was really surprised, and that struck me as like, oh, this feels different than and now that's like anecdotal, and that was just me being put in a certain place and time, but for me and the upbringing and looking and all the American media I consumed, that struck me as different. And then I was like, okay, I'm wondering where this is all going to go. And here we are today talking about it.
Yeah, and I think that's really important because those visual symbols and cues of Nazism, for example, didn't just start in 2016, of course, but have become more okay since 2016. And so we're seeing more of them, right? So, and that's true in Canada too. More racism, more xenophobia, more anti-Muslim sentiment, more gay bashing, more all kinds of stuff that's happening down there is happening here too. And I think there's two weird floods. I should never do this. No metaphors. Two movements happening at once that could collide. Yeah. On the one hand, you have this kind of increasing reactionary type views that are on the rise. And they're on the rise in Canada and they're on the rise in the US. At the same time in Canada right now, because of what Trump has just done, you have this new nationalism that's coming through. But those other underlying sentiments are still there. Yeah. And so this is where things get weird and messy and people are messy, and that's part of it. And so we're seeing changes because of the stuff that has gone on over the last 10 years. And we will continue to see, you asked that question of like, can we reverse the damage? This is damage. Yeah. And we're doing it here too. Yeah, and that's the part that's scary.
Right. Multiple things can be true at once. Yeah. Things are complex. Things are not always, cut and dry, as we say. So where do we go from here? With as we wait for the TikTok of well, is it a tariff or not, or a double tariff or whatever else comes, plus what we're trying to do with buy Canadian, buy local, just living, maybe having businesses thinking maybe I can invest in something or try to grow. What are your thoughts in the last 5 minutes here about the road forward from your points of view and your seats?
I think one thing, just thinking about the business side of things, continue to diversify our markets, right? So that's something that's been attempted on and off for a variety of different products that we have here. Certainly in Newfoundland, if we think about seafood, for instance, all of our seafood that goes to the U.S.
So much.
Yeah, and a big push over the years on and off over the last 20 or more years about European markets, Asian markets as well. So, whether that's our kind of our natural resources or our manufactured products, seeking new markets for all those things, and that requires market development, of course. So, I do think there is any silver lining to be taken from this is probably two things. Is one, we need to do those types of things anyway, just the way the U.S. is trending long tail. The second thing is just a reminder of how precious and also I guess how delicate what we have in Canada is, right? So seeing what is happening in the U.S. should be a reminder to us of what can happen. There's nothing special about Canada or any of the other countries that what has happened to every other country in the world won't happen to us, right? So the idea that it needs to be renewed and protected and invested in, and coming back to our core values, which we spoke about earlier, how we do that, and not forgetting those as we go forward.
All right. Thoughts?
I mean, I think I'm going to go back to the idea of you can only control what you can control, right? And so nothing that we do in this country is going to get rid of Trump. We have him for the next several years. I won't limit it to 4 just in case. Sorry,
it's a different choose your own adventure thing happening now. Who knows where it goes? Sure,
but I think I think the reality is that none of that. We can't control any of those things. So how do we stay calm? How do we regulate our emotions? How do we make sure that we're not acting out of a place of fear or defensiveness, but we are approaching the things that we can control with as much calmness and rationality as possible?
Amanda?
So like Scott, I study voters and public opinion and trying to understand what makes us all tick and why we do what we do. And I keep thinking about how hard it is to be a regular person right now. It's hard to be a nerd right now, to be clear. But it's hard to be a regular person right now. It's hard to make sense of what's going on. And the information that we're receiving is confusing, conflicted, a lot of disinformation. And so where do we go from here? From my perspective, we need to beef up media.
Yeah.
And I'm saying that while grinning at you because obviously I'm not critiquing you, but I think we need more fact checking. We need more awareness of the dangers of the algorithms and the information that we're all being fed because we're all receiving information that's faulty. And so how do we take it upon ourselves to sort of wade through that? But also how do we make sure that we force opposition parties to hold governments to account? How do we force people to say, no, that's actually not factual? And I think that's something that if we could really strengthen that part over the next little while, then we'll be in better shape for the future.
Right. Scott Matthews.
Well, I really like Desmond's advice, kind of personal care advice. And it actually dovetails with what I want to suggest, which is, the long term is really what we should be focusing on. I mean, the last 25, almost 40 years, really, but certainly since the 2000s, there's been a pattern that has repeated itself in American politics, which is the ambitions of the new president die on the altar of the first midterm elections. And I think it's very likely to be the case here. Imagine Trump with quite a lot of luck with his party in the House of Representatives, may be able to get 1 or 2 big bills passed that make a big difference. But that will probably exhaust them. And then they'll be campaigning for the next midterm election, which, if voters do really respond to what I assume will be pretty devastating effects of a lot of what Trump is doing in lots of different domains, they will lose their razor-thin majority in the House, at least. And the remainder of Trump's term will be, kind of stasis. And so the long term is what we should be thinking about. Don't react to everything that Trump is doing, everything you hear in the news. And take care of yourselves and shovel your snow, I guess.
All right. Well, thank you, folks. We're out of time, and we'll end on a George W. Bush quote. There's an old saying in Tennessee, I know it's in Texas, probably in Tennessee, that says, "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me, you can't get fooled again." That's it for the show today, folks. Thank you so much for listening. If you've got thoughts for us, 709-576-5260. Coming up on Monday, we'll speak with folks from the Ukrainian local diaspora here about the anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Do not miss that show. Have yourselves a good weekend. I got a note for driving on the Avalon right now. Super slippery on the highways, so be very careful.